Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I thank His Excellency for his gracious address opening the 2020-2021 session of Parliament. Before I speak on His Excellency's address, Mr. Speaker, I would like to pay tribute to my friend, iTaukei Radute. Thank you to all who joined us in VCC village this past Friday as we paid our final respects to Radute, who we remembered as a proud son of Fiji. All his life, he put his communities and his country before himself, particularly in some defining moments of Fijian history. Twice in May 2000 and March of 2001, he was appointed Prime Minister. Both times, Mr. Speaker, he stepped aside to allow for a peaceful transition of power. In mourning his passing, we must all strive to honor the legacy of peace and patriotism he has left behind. God bless his soul, God bless his good soul, and God bless his family. Now, Mr. Speaker, I want to update the nation on the two potential border quarantine cases we identified over the weekend. Both of these cases were aboard a freighter vessel delivering cargo to Fiji from New Zealand. We are in the process of confirming these test results, which we have returned what are called weak positive results, most likely indicative of an older infection which has not been contagious for some time. The indicators all point to a low-risk situation. Our infection protocols were well enforced, and none of the crew on board ever disembarked. But because we would always be rather be safe than sorry, we will be taking some additional precautions until we are sure there's zero risk of public transmission. Anyone who had any chance of contracting the virus has been entered into quarantine, and we have reduced patient loads at the Colonial War Memorial Hospital and the Lautoka Hospital as a standard precautionary measures until we confirm the exact nature of these cases. Mr. Speaker, if anyone was wondering why our COVID safe restrictions have remained in place, these potential cases are why. This situation has driven home the urgency of His Excellency's opening address for this session of Parliament, in which he highlighted the serious threat we still face from this pandemic. To drive the point home further, in the 7 days since His Excellency addressed this August Parliament, more than 4 million more COVID-19 infections have been recorded around the world. More than 100,000 lives have been cut short by this plague in the US alone, and 1.6 million lives have been cut short worldwide. In the United States, it is reported that nearly 2 more people are dying from the virus every minute. Most everywhere on earth, every day this pandemic breaks its own terrifying records. Mr. Speaker, the Fijian people placed their votes and their trust with this government because they knew what they were getting. They wanted strong, sensible, and decisive leadership in good time and bad. They wanted leadership whose energy was dedicated to them, the people, not to pettiness or party politics. Through this pandemic, that is the leadership we have supplied. That is the leadership that has kept Fijians safe. Ironically, the proof is not in what happened, but in what did not happen. In lives that were not lost, in families that were not destroyed, in communities that were not wholly consumed by sickness. Months into this national effort, my message to every member in this House and to every Fijian watching this proceeding is, do not forget the stakes in this fight. Do not downplay this life or death threat. Do not retreat from reality. This pandemic is not over, nor will it be for some time. The virus may be the killer, but complacency is its unwitting accomplice. Mr. Speaker, let us remember the spirit that guided the Fijian people through those difficult months. As His Excellency aptly described it, the truly patriotic whole-of-nation effort was why Fiji is succeeding, even when so many larger, wealthier, and more developed nations are not. It is why we are a COVID-contained country for more than 240 days, and why we have remained a COVID-contained country even as border quarantine cases have emerged. The fact is that the system we established to keep us safe is doing its job. And the record that we, the government and the people, have achieved gives me great confidence that we can realize our ambition for this session of Parliament, that we will strive to keep Fiji COVID contained and trusting the same science-based approach that has saved so many Fijians' lives this year. And that we will chart an inclusive economic recovery, one that upholds every Fijian's civil, political and socio-economic rights. And even in the midst of this pandemic, we will not ignore Fiji's duty to confront the climate, ocean and biodiversity crisis that threaten humanity's very survival on the planet. When it comes to keeping Fiji COVID contained, Mr. Speaker, every Fijian has a role to play. We will rely on doctors and the nurses and the members of our disciplined forces to enforce our infection control protocols at our border. And we will rely on ordinary citizens to cement the changes that we have made in the ways we live our lives and to respect the health protection measures which remain in place so as to keep us COVID ready at all times. For the foreseeable future, Mr. Speaker, the 11 p.m. until 4 a.m. nationwide curfew will remain, as will the capacity restrictions on sporting events and large public gatherings. Those former nightclubs which have been granted approval to operate as venues where people can eat and share drinks with their friends must play by the rules. No dancing and no loud music. Break those rules and you will be shut down. We anticipate, we anticipate heavy travel during this month due to the Christmas holiday, Mr. Speaker. Everyone who plans to travel to Fiji must test negative for the virus prior to boarding a flight, spend the full 14-day period in quarantine, and then test negative again before engaging the public. No exceptions. Mr. Speaker, we should be proud of Fiji's exceptional record at containing COVID-19 today. But I say that knowing fully well the job is not done. I say that knowing that Fijians have not been spared from suffering. We are still enduring the worst global economic recession since the Great Depression. Fiji's initial economic contraction now stands at just over 19%, still the single worst drop in our history. We should be grateful we have our lives, but the task now before us is to fight for our people's livelihoods. We must work just as hard. We must lead just as decisively if we are to bring our economy back from the brink. Again, it will take the same truly patriotic whole-of-nation effort that it took to contain the virus itself. Since April, as soon as it was safe to do so, I've held Talanoa sessions in over 40 communities, from across Voreqe to the Lomaiviti group, to Kandau, and to our other outer islands communities in Lau, to the deep rural pockets of Vitilevu, to our urban settlements. I have toured the isolation wards. I have visited our fever clinics and the hospitals. I have spoken to women and men on front lines of this effort. I have been on the ground in communities affected by Cyclone Harold. That is how and where I choose to consult with the nation. I know in a very personal way how hard this has been on our people, because I've listened to the experiences and felt the determination not to be forgotten, not to be overlooked in the struggle before us. I have also joined my fellow leaders the forefront of the global response to this challenge. Most recently, last week, at a special United Nations summit on the global COVID-19 response. Frankly, Mr. Speaker, I felt that meeting was long overdue. But slowly and surely, we are building a genuinely multilateral response, not only to stop the spread, but to ensure all nations are part of a vaccine-protected world and an inclusive economic recovery. Mr. Speaker, we must consider both the global and the local if we are to emerge from this crisis whole. We cannot be short-sighted nor narrow-minded about where Fiji fits in this great multilateral equation. We must see the forest from the trees by strategically positioning Fiji for the opportunities we expect will gradually come to us through the course of next year, including the safe reopening of our borders. Mr. Speaker, right now, as His Excellency noted, governments are fueling their response and recoveries through an unprecedented fiscal effort. Governments are borrowing and spending trillions of dollars to stimulate their economies and support their most vulnerable citizens. As a direct result, global debt has risen 11%. In advanced economies, governments are maxing out the fiscal tools at their disposal. Their collective debt has risen to nearly $200 trillion, equivalent to more than 431% of GDP. That's up 50% percentage points since 2019. An American senator, Mr. Speaker, Mitt Romney, put the urgency of the moment quite well, saying, "I don't like borrowing money. I don't like spending money we don't have. But the time to borrow money, maybe the only time to borrow money, is when there is a crisis, like now. And this is a crisis." Mr. Speaker, borrowing may be a bitter pill for the governments of these larger countries, but it is the only treatment keeping the global economy afloat. In this new era of flexible fiscal policy, Fiji has choices: fall behind or keep pace. The cost of hesitation are just as high as they were on the 19th of March, the day Fiji recorded its first case of the coronavirus. While we have tightened our belt when it comes to expenditure, we must continue funding support for our businesses, especially our micro, small, and medium enterprises, MSMEs, along with our people's well-being. We will never regain the full strength of our economy. And 10, 20, even 30 years from now, we will find ourselves lagging behind from the rest of the world. We will not let that be the legacy of this session. Mr. Speaker, we set out early in this government to erase the inequalities in Fijian society, including between rural and urban areas, as much as we can, and to bring greater opportunity and prosperity to all Fijians. We cannot stop now, and especially when their need is greatest. We must continue our development in every way we can. In Tabuki village in Kandavu, women like Ranandi, Wangani Tabuki used to have to carry water in buckets when it was delivered to their village by boat. Much water was lost along the way, spilling from the water tank or splashing out from the buckets, but no more. Because we continued our development programs and completed a system to pipe water to the islands and store it safely. There are countless similar stories I could tell this morning. Mr. Speaker, those kinds of projects, and it cannot be put off. Our recovery must be inclusive, and it must be even and equitable. We cannot overlook any Fijian, because this country belongs to all Fijians. All Fijians are making a sacrifice. All Fijians have faced the risk of falling ill to COVID, and all Fijians must have a share in the recovery and a chance to recover what they have lost. If we are to have an inclusive and equal recovery, we must continue our support to micro, small, and medium enterprises. We have supported these businesses, including those who may have been laid off but have particular skills to start their own businesses, with nearly $15 million as of last month. But talking about the program as a whole doesn't tell the human story, Mr. Speaker, and I think we need to hear what it means from the Fijians it has supported. One of those Fijians was Ms. Sunita Kumar, who received a concessional loan worth $14,000 to sustain her cover business in Nandi. She, like many, felt the crunch of this economic slowdown, but thanks to those funds, she can keep her store running, she can keep 2 Fijians she has employed in their job, and she has continued buying from the Ngona farmers from whom she sources her product. As we weather this storm together, support for hard-working women like Ms. Kumar and other business owners across the country must continue. And we must set the stage for domestic investment and job creation. We must support domestic industry, including the cane industry, to remain sources of prosperity for those who depend on them. We must encourage those with assets, like our land-owning communities, to make productive use of them, creating economic activity that benefit their communities and the nation. Now is the time for all those who can make such investments to make them. The day will come when our borders reopen. We will become the economically prosperous nation we were, but only if we prepare for that opportunity now. Finally, Mr. Speaker, we come to the third great challenge His Excellency set before us: the changing climate, our threatened oceans, and the need to preserve diversity on this planet. In the eyes of the rest of the world, Fiji is no longer a small, exotic land in the middle of the Pacific. It may have been true 15 years ago. It was certainly true under past governments, but we are no longer just a place for a vacation or destination wedding. We are no longer just a romanticized island paradise. We are a leader. We count for something. What we say and what we do matters. We have earned that place in the world, and it is this government's aim to keep it and strengthen it. I need not recite here the stakes, because we all know them, and we know them all too well. We see them in villages that must be relocated, in farmland that must be protected against salinization from the rising seas, in schools and roads and homes and water systems that need to be strengthened. Mr. Speaker, some challenges are meant to be overcome in a known period of time. We will defeat COVID, and relatively soon, and our economy will recover. But some challenges are meant to be managed over the long term. Climate change and ocean health are among those. We will be adapting to climate change for many years to come. The work of protecting this country against a changing climate will never end. And the need to reduce our carbon emissions and transform our economy into one that is carbon neutral and completely sustainable with energy that is completely renewable is a long-term project that will help us manage this crisis. This session will make history through the passage of our climate change bill and legislate our commitment to lead by example towards a net zero future. Fiji will lead by doing, but we will also continue to raise our voice in the international arena, to encourage, to demand, to shame if necessary, but to move all the nations in the world to a position of responsibility and solidarity. I believe we are finally seeing some significant movement among the larger industrialized and emerging economies. The renewed American commitment to the Paris Agreement is a very hopeful sign, but it is not the only one. It will be Fiji's job to acknowledge those efforts and then insist on more. Mr. Speaker, we owe that to our children and grandchildren, to our fellow vulnerable nations. We owe it to all of humanity. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.